All right, welcome back. Welcome back to another episode here in Verano 1711 podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about a very important topic, and I am joined by two distinguished ladies, Professor Bond, Helen Bond, and Professor Catherine Williams. Welcome. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Hello.
And thank you for kindly, making some space in your agenda. I know your schedules are very tight. So the fact that you're here is really, really appreciated. So I think we're gonna have fun about this topic.
Mm.
You know, Gospels and the way they were written in the past, there's a lot of questions. Either if you're a scholar or a layman, or as what John J. Collins used to call, educated non-specialist, I
Mm.
will go in that pocket. So we have a lot of questions, and scholars continue to, produce quality content, academic literature that we need to study. And this book, John's Transformation of Mark, I think it's trying to fill that void to some degree. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. But before, I'm going to go with you first, Professor Bond, just for people who may not be aware of who you are. I want to ask you both to go and present a little bit about yourself, your background, and credentials, please.
Okay, I'm from United Kingdom, from the northern part of England, but I've lived in Scotland for most of my life now. I studied biblical studies at St Andrews University, Durham, and also a year in Tübingen. I'm currently Professor of Christian Origins at the University of Edinburgh. I've been there a very long time. And I've written books on Pontius Pilate, Caiaphas the high priest, Jesus, most recently one on Mark as the first biography of Jesus, and edited a few things too, including the book we're going to talk about today with Catherine.
Definitely. Professor Williams, you go now. Tell us who you are. Tell us your
Okay,
life.
so I'm based in South Wales. So yes, UK, but specifically in Wales, where I've spent most of my life, apart from a few years working in Oxford, but also I was a PhD student at the University of Cambridge. I did my first degree in biblical studies, which I think is quite rare these days. There aren't many places where you would be able to spend 3 years learning Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic. But so that was the path I chose. So I've worked in various universities. I also spent time in Tübingen, Helen, at different times, but both Helen and I had the opportunity to work with some big names in the German in German scholarship, especially Martin Hegel, of course. But so I've worked mainly on the Johannine literature, on the Gospel of John. So I've written on the I am sayings, and I've also done several edited volumes linked to John's Gospel. I did write a commentary on the Book of Revelation in Welsh, so that's not going to be something that many people listening to this podcast are going to be able to look at. But anyway, and my current project is a commentary on the letters of John. So I'm diversifying a little bit, not enough maybe, but I'm working on a commentary for the International Critical Commentary series, which is one of those, thick tomes, which will probably take me to the end of my life.
My goodness.
Yeah.
Professor...
Sorry,
yeah,
go
ahead.
I've just finished recently in my role at the University of Wales. But another link with Helen is that I'm an honorary research fellow at the University of Edinburgh, which I'm very proud of.
Marvelous. No, I was just going to say about the ICC commentaries. Professor John Day, he's writing the commentary on Book of Genesis. And now I know that you're writing a commentary in that prestigious series. So good for you both.
He's got a lot of chapters to go through.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Professor Bond, who was your Dr. Votter?
It was Jimmy Dunn at Durham. And as Catherine says, we both worked with Martin Hegel. You were with Martin Hegel as well in Tübingen, weren't you?
Yes.
Yeah. So we were both with Hengel in Tübingen. So yeah, no, I feel like I was really lucky to have two really, really amazing people with completely sort of, very different styles. But still, it was a really good introduction to, British way of doing things and the German way of doing things. So I enjoyed working with both of them.
Great. All right. I will spend much time talking about your lives. I mean, there's a lot of things to talk about, but let's move the conversation because I want to value your time and just keep the pace here. So let's go. Just dive right in here in the first questions. So, by way of introduction to a wider audience, how would you describe the purpose of this book as well as the topic tackled in it? Either of you.
Well, as you can see from the image next to the question, there are two figures there. One of them looks a little bit pained, really, a bit painful. The other one is much younger, and it's a medieval wooden sculpture of Mark and John. And traditionally, especially when we go back to kind of the church fathers, early Christian traditions, that kind of connection that we see in this image of them somehow clasping each other's hands, although they're not actually clasping it, but it looks as though they are, is something that was pretty well accepted, that John, when writing what's known as the fourth gospel, did actually know Mark, and where the three other evangelists had given the kind of the historical images of Jesus, the historical facts, that what we find in John's gospel is a spiritual interpretation, the spiritual gospel, as Clement of Alexandria called it. So that was the position for many, many centuries. And then in the early 20th century, with the rise of form criticism, the emphasis on oral traditions, on the notion of pools of tradition and independent sources and so forth, it became very popular in Johannine studies, certainly in studies of the Gospel of John, to claim that John was written in completely independently of Mark. So we've kind of, our volume was an attempt, I think, there were other people obviously who were thinking along these terms. You think about the Leuven school in Belgium, people like Frans Neerink, Gilbert van Belle and others who had been working on many articles, particularly kind of looking at close literary connections between John and Mark, and also Luke and Matthew. But I and Helen can, will expand on this and say what she thinks about why we brought the volume together. But I think it was an attempt to kind of revisit the question, but to do so with a group of people who represented what was going on in Europe, but also the American scene, but trying to bring together whole kind of different approaches to this question. So the volume does talk very much about methodology in the first sections, and then the kind of looking and testing out some ideas about the connections through by looking at specific passages and themes in the second half. So that, I think, was the kind of overall purpose of the book. But Helen can say a lot more about that.
Yeah, sure. No, that's exactly what I would have said.
Tag team.
I don't know exactly when it was, but I mean, both of us were taught, as Katrin says, sort of mid to late 20th century. The view was very much that Mark and John were completely separate, different, independent tradition that John was making use of. And I think we were both taught that John was sort of a separate thing to the synoptic gospels. But at some point, I think we both had a chat, and I was very surprised to find out that Katrin didn't think that John was entirely independent from Mark. And I had come to the conclusion that John definitely knew Mark, because a lot of my work was comparing 4 gospel passages of the same person, the same story. And every time I thought there's definitely a connection between John and Mark. And so, but at the time it was sort of not really the thing, and to try and make more of it would have just needed more than just a footnote, an extended discussion. So I'd never really sort of got round to doing much more about it, and then we thought, let's have a conference, let's invite all the big people we know who are working in John or Mark, and we got together with Eva Maria Becker from Aarhus at the time, but she moved to Münster, wasn't it? So that was great, having another person, another contact. And initially we just invited people to a conference and said, compare and contrast something in John and Mark. And it doesn't matter, if you think there's a connection, great. But if you think they're completely independent, that's also great. Doesn't matter at all what you come up with. And then we were really surprised, weren't we, in the course of the conference, that one person after another kept saying, yes, I think John is working with Mark in some way. I mean, the question of method, as Katrin says, was quite an issue. How exactly is John working with Mark? But the overriding consensus was that John is working with this earlier gospel. So that gave the volume much more coherence, actually, which I think in the end has been a strength of it, because it's now really sort of pushing a particular interpretation of John's use of Mark.
Great. All right. As a layman, perhaps because I consider myself to be someone with a big imagination, so since I was a child, I always had this idea that it was possible. It was not a far-fetched idea that the original writers, they know each other, and maybe they were doing something in the literary layer, in these works. So now, what about 32 years afterwards, I'm looking at this kind of work, and that's refreshing and opening new vistas.
You were right all the
time. Well, perhaps, but the way you say that it's a consensus makes me think that it's something that we can firmly argue, for this phenomena, and it's not that far-fetched anymore, I think. Do you think there is some kind of, perhaps not opposition, but I mean, I understand scholarly works are always receiving critical, reviews and everything, but do you think there is big opposition to this work, or is not that big of a deal? It's just fitting there.
I think it was a bit of a juggernaut, really, this idea of John's independence. That was, as Helen was saying, that's how we were taught. That's what was the kind of consensus, that they worked independently of each other. But I think there are some factors that may account for this kind of shift. One is perhaps a greater sense among scholars now that we work with what we've got rather than working with hypothetical sources. And it's something that happens in all kinds of different questions of relationships, gospel relationships in particular. Why do we need to kind of reconstruct this notion of an independent pool of traditions, something very fluid, something very kind of intangible in a way, whereas maybe we should have given that we can give more intention to the question and the possibility that these authors are working with each other, that John in particular here is literarily dependent on Mark in some way. And the other thing is that we have a much more kind of fluid sense now of what the compositional techniques were in the ancient world. my sense when I was a student, and again, is that we were kind of conditioned to think that you approach this question through the lens of how Matthew and Luke have used Mark. So that if they are so closely linked to Mark and using it verbatim and just kind of adding certain elements here and there, but on the whole, you could, that synoptic comparison, which you couldn't do in the same way with John, that really conditioned us to think, well, because John is so different, then it cannot have known Mark. And that, I think, has shifted now because of what we know about how other ancient writers use their sources.
I think
Professor Juan?
another reason why, in a way, this is sort of timely, and I mean that we're not the only people doing this. There are other people too. There's been quite a surge of people being looking at the relationship between John and Mark in particular. But I think another reason why it just seems to be sort of doing very well at the moment is that whole form critical explanation of things with bits of oral tradition floating about, and the way that I mean there are clear similarities between John and Mark. The story of the feeding of the 5,000 followed by the walking on the water. I mean, though that looks like some kind of literary borrowing, and the way it was always explained was, oh well, it's oral tradition, or it's a small fragment that's floating about. And again, those were popular opinions in the 60s, 70s, 80s, but nowadays people don't really kind of go with them quite so much. And the major commentaries on John, Brown and Lindars and Schnackenberg, all of these big people, they didn't think that John knew Mark, and so I think that was quite influential too.
Thank you. Okay, moving forward here to the second question. So, new or not so new, what can you tell us about the history of the debate around canonical gospels and their relationship, Mark and John, to be more specific?
Do you want to go first, Helen?
Yeah, okay. I mean, I think we've covered some of this.
We've covered a lot of this already. Yeah.
I mean, as Catherine said, for years and years and years, for most of Christian history, up to about the early 19th century, people just assumed that John was just doing his own thing. But of course, he knew the others. He just, he's not going to write the same thing again. He's just writing his own account in a different way. It was really in the early 20th century that instead of noting the similarities, people started to note the differences and to say, well, how do we explain the differences? And then the most likely scenario seemed to be that John was writing independently, but just had shared oral traditions, or fragments of traditions written, just one or two stories on a piece of paper, and that explained the similarities. So I think throughout most of Christian history, it's been a very different story. So all we're suggesting really is that we go back to an earlier reading. But as Catherine said, that idea that John knew Mark never disappeared. C.K. Barrett in Durham in England was a major exponent of that view. The Leuven School, as Catherine's already said, Andrew Lincoln in his commentary, other commentaries, there's been other studies done too. So there's always been those voices, particularly I think in Europe, that have said, well, hold on a little bit, is this really likely that John didn't know the others? I mean, when you think about it, Mark is busily going around and used by both Luke and Matthew, but then the idea that John knows none of them, when in many ways it's so similar. It's a biography. It devotes half of the biography to the death of Jesus. It seems unlikely that John really didn't know the others.
Yeah. Professor Williams?
It gives this idea that somehow, Mark was just kind of was the kind of the frame that And is it, how likely is it that John, completely independently of Mark, would have come up with a similar framework, an outline which starts, if you put the prologue aside, that where does the gospel narrative itself starts with John the Baptist, and of course that's where Mark starts as well. They both interestingly start with the words "in the beginning," but for Mark it's in the beginning of the gospel. For John it's in the beginning of all time, of pre-creation. So you can just kind of imagine John thinking, well, there's more to be said about this in the beginning than the kind of the ministry, or the beginning of the ministry of the earthly Jesus. So but also those kind of the emphasis you get in John on a kind of a shortish ministry, and then half the gospel is dedicated to what happens basically in a little over a week, and you get that same kind of balance of emphasis in Mark. So the idea that two authors, completely independently of each other, would have come up with a similar focus is perhaps unusual, and maybe we think unlikely.
Yeah.
All right, then go there. Okay. So, question number 3. In terms of, I like this one, okay? In terms of parallels and reimaginations in John's Gospel, what would be some good examples where such literary phenomena take place?
Yeah, I mean, just so many. I mean, what we did with the conference was, as I said, get people just to choose, any topic they like. So Jörg Frey, for example, chose eschatology, and he looked at Mark's eschatology, which is very much focused on, the end, the apocalyptic idea of the end of things, the dawning of this sort of new age, particularly chapter 13 and the return of the Son of Man. And then compared that with John's Gospel, where you still get some little bits of that, but alongside them is this overriding emphasis on realized eschatology. You can have eternal life now when you believe in Christ. So I think you can kind of see some developments in cases like that between, theological developments between perhaps an earlier gospel, Mark's Gospel probably coming from the early 70s, something like that, and John's Gospel, who knows, I don't know, 90s, 100, something like that, quite a lot later, when the idea has already sort of, the apocalyptic idea perhaps has sort of burnt itself out, and it's now focus on something realized that you can have now in the present. So there are theological changes by Luke, but sometimes literary changes too, or he changes characters. John the Baptist in each one, as Catherine says, he's there at the very beginning, very important character, setting the scene for Jesus. But in Mark's Gospel, he's presented as Elijah, and his ministry has to come to an end. He's arrested before Jesus starts his ministry. In John's Gospel, though, John the Baptist has a different function, and his function there is to act as a witness to Jesus. So in John's Gospel, you have to have a parallel ministry for a while so that John can bear witness to who Jesus is. So I think a lot of these changes, at first you just think, oh, they're just different. But when you think about why are they different? Why might John have changed what he saw in Mark? It sort of makes sense. And quite often, I think, things that are just there in sort of very sort of minor form in Mark really get expanded in John. And it's just the combination of all of these things makes you think this does seem to be an author who's working with an earlier text, but really thinking deeply about it and bringing out all the sort of hidden or latent meanings there.
Yeah.
All right.
There's one of the two actually of the essays in the volume approach this question with different kind of methodological paradigms. You've got Jean Zumstein uses hypertextuality, and then you have Chris Keith talking about critical inheritance from a social memory perspective. And both of them use those approaches to look at not just where John is building or supplementing or developing what Mark is doing, but also quite, as the phrase critical inheritance suggests, kind of reinterpreting in a different way, in line with John's own kind of design, literary design, but also theological message. So you've got, you know, in relation to the Gethsemane scene in Mark, Jesus is you know, in anguish and about the hour of suffering having come, and then in John it's moved to the middle of the gospel before the farewell discourse, and there kind of Jesus asks the question, you know, should he kind of just succumb to this suffering and anguish? No, for this hour I have come. So you kind of imagine John there knowing about the kind of the image of the Mark and Jesus facing suffering, and how this in a way is incongruent with the Johannine theme of Jesus, Johannine presentation of Jesus as one who is in control, faces his death with courage, because this is in line with the divine plan. So that's just another example, you know.
One of my favorite bits is where John says, you know, about Jesus with the cross, and he says he carried his own cross. And, you know, what a bizarre thing to say. Why on earth would he say that? Because all prisoners, as far as we know, carried their own cross. But it only makes sense when you know that there's another very important tradition in Mark's gospel that says that Simon of Cyrene carried Jesus's cross. So, you know, you do, as Captain says, you do get these bits that's where he does seem to be deliberately kind of, you know, countering what he has in Mark. So it's not all positive.
Thank you for that. All right. So this is not exactly a question, but, you know, I like this one because I give you the opportunity to, I know this is very difficult. I tried to say this to every scholar to come on to the show. It's very difficult for scholars to synthesize, you know, the views. There's a lot to say, but you made your own contribution to the book. So we're going to go with you first, Professor Williams. So give us an overview about your chapter in the book.
Okay, so I've done a lot of work on looking at how the author of John's Gospel engages with Jewish techniques, with interpretative methods, particularly in relation to engagement with scripture. And I'd been working on some material, you know, looking at the whole question in Qumran studies, actually, on what this kind of phenomenon known as rewritten Bible or rewritten scripture, and this kind of category of texts which are rewritings of authoritative scriptural books, especially the Pentateuch. You've got Genesis Apocryphon, the Temple Scroll, Jubilees, and then, of course, first 10, 11 books of Josephus's Antiquities. And it struck me that the kind of techniques that you encounter there in terms of these texts rewriting very important sacred texts is actually not, you know, kind of following them closely, as kind of step by step, but using a whole spectrum of techniques that could include embellishment, expansion, but also omission, working with sources in blocks. So you'd have a section in Jubilees which follows Genesis quite closely or Exodus quite closely, and then it goes its own way for another block. And you see very strong resemblances between that kind of method of composition as as you get in John's use of Mark. So that's what my essay seeks to do. I mean, a lot of work had already been done looking at the Greek and Roman compositional techniques, and in particular, the use of paraphrase, and that paraphrase was really encouraged as a way of demonstrating the authority of your new text, even though you're kind of using a lot of sources. And so that's what my essay seeks to do, is to look at those techniques, not just from a Greek and Roman perspective, but how this, in fact, aligns with, this kind of the Jewishness of John's Gospel in terms of where it comes from what kind of matrix it emerges. So I also tried to deal with the whole question of authority, because, as Helen was saying, one of the big questions is what was the nature of the relationship between John and Mark? Is it a supplement or is it a replacement? And what's interesting is with these texts is that they will rework the early scriptural books quite extensively, but that doesn't kind of diminish the authority they afford to the original text. But they also seek to rewrite these texts to establish their own authority as well. So it's that kind of really interesting relationship between the kind of the antecedent text, the predecessor text, and a rewritten text. So that's what I sought to do in mine.
Thank you. If there is a one main takeaway here from your chapter, is that these people is not operating in a vacuum. I mean, they are working with rhetorical devices, licenses that are operative in their time and day, and they're using. I mean, they're literary geniuses, if I can use that word. They're not isolated, making up stuff about this. Which is something that we talked with Professor Bond on her book, the biography of Jesus. Yeah. So now let's go with your book chapter, Professor Bond, which is, I like the title, "The Triumph of the King." My mother would say the King of Kings, just to add another word. So let's go with you there. What you came to tell us about your book chapter?
Yeah, so I wanted to have a look at the passion narrative in the two works, because on one level, they're completely different. Mark has this picture of this shameful death that's sort of made right again by the resurrection, but even that in Mark's gospel is fairly understated and ambiguous at the end. On the other hand, you have John, and for John, the cross is this glorification. It's the lifting up, this great sort of triumphant ending. And, Jesus dies with those words, "It is finished," in John, whereas in Mark, it's my God, why have you forsaken me?" So on one level, they're really, really different presentations. But at the same time, there are similarities in terms of, the sequence of events and some elements that you have there, to the extent that sometimes people argue that both evangelists knew a sort of a passion narrative, that so rather than John knowing Mark, there was some shared narrative that they both drew on. Like Katrin said earlier, I mean, I'm not a big fan of these sort of made up sources when there's another explanation sort of close at hand, which is simply that John knows Mark. And so what I was wanting to do in my chapter, I think there's sometimes this tendency to sort of think that Mark is giving almost sort of a historical account, and then John is sort of spiritualizing it or making it more theological. And what I wanted to show was that both actually are equally theological, Mark as much as John. So I went through Mark's account of Jesus's death, trying to explain why I think it was important for him to have Jesus die as a slave. And this sort of this fits in with the basic idea of, a crucifixion. This is a slave's death, and also fits in with the teaching in Mark's gospel, be like a slave, make yourself last, don't seem to be first. So I think it's all very coherent in Mark's gospel. When you come to John, though, he clearly just wants to give a very different picture of the cross. And I think, so he cuts out consistently anything that's too shameful, too slave-like, and instead has these elements of triumph and glory. But one of the things I've always noted, actually, and I was able to sort of explore in this essay, was the way little motifs that are just there in sort of implicit form in Mark are really sort of put center stage in John. So, for example, Jesus in Mark's gospel, although he dies a slave's death, there's the title above the cross that says, the King of the Jews. And there's elements there that allow you to see that despite appearances, Jesus really is the king. And there's all these sort of omens or portents at the moment of death. The sky turns dark, and that's often associated with the death of a king. The tearing of the veil, all of these things. But so I think John understands what Mark is doing, but he just wants to get rid of the shameful stuff and really kind of go big on the kingship and glory idea, the triumph. So I think that was really what I was hoping to argue for in that chapter.
Yeah. And can we say that there is perhaps, in my own thinking, we can see those changes due to some theological agenda behind the text. They want to, telegraph some message or many messages, I don't know. And that's why they're doing the transformation or reimagination kind of stuff. In this case, the passion. Is that possible, or is something that it goes beyond that?
Yeah, I think it's largely theological. It's largely writing for people who want to see the glory behind Jesus's crucifixion. Mark's presentation is not what everybody would want. It's very he can't get over the fact that Jesus was crucified. I think that was something that was so well known. He had to kind of, I think his strategy was to sort of make a positive thing out of it, link it up with Jesus's preaching, and then make Jesus the ultimate example of making yourself last. That doesn't appeal to everybody, and it maybe didn't appeal to John, or maybe John also thought, well, to go back to that idea of complementing or supplementing, maybe what John is doing is sort of deliberately helping people to see the glory in Jesus's cross, knowing that it's going to be read alongside Mark's gospel. So you have these different aspects to it.
Look at that. Before just hitting to the last question here, we have to do with scholarly literature. The title of the book, is it safe, or maybe not safe, but is it accurate to assume that you guys are taking mark and priority just by the title, or just going over the essays? Is that something to assume?
We have to assume something.
Yeah. Or we as readers should be cautious, not just to be careful. No, don't do that.
So are you
because that was my
whether
first
it
impression.
could be Mark's transformation of John? Is that or
Yeah, I mean, because the title is John's transformation of Mark.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna speak for myself. When I read the title, okay, so these guys maybe they are taking Mark and priority,
Yeah.
but I'm wrong. So that's why my question to you.
Yeah, we were. I mean, I think, because the origin of the conference was sort of compare and contrast and see what you make of these two things, there was always the option of going the other way and saying, I really think that Mark is doing something with the Johannine text here, but not a single person did that. And certainly my own chapter, I don't think it would make any sense. And mark and priority is so well established that I think what we're saying about John's use of mark is going to get enough eyebrows raised without saying without throwing everything up as well.
Professor Williams, you were about to say something.
No, I was just thinking, well, what would it look like to imagine John kind of being used by Mark, and it would be a good experiment actually, just to kind of test out the way so some of the essays that we have in our volume kind of look at it from another perspective, and what kind of techniques of composition would be involved in doing it that way. I think it would be more kind of an outlier in terms of what we know about how ancient authors use their sources, really, to kind of go from something that is very developed and repeats itself, because John is kind of comes back to the same themes and develops them. Well, why would Mark then, having got that developed notion of glory or the hidden Messiah, as Mark Goodacre argues in his essay for our volume, but also in his most recent book, would it make sense to see it from that other perspective? And I think that the answer would be no.
Okay. You have it there.
Well, I mean, again, this is what we wanted to do, was generate more debate, and all these ideas always have to be tested out and revisited. Of course, that's otherwise we just run out of things to do, wouldn't we?
Thank you. Yeah, let's go there. So. What else do we have here? Let me just put it right here. This one has to do with, in what ways do you see this book of yours, moving the debate and the current conversation from how the Gospels came to be in the first place, and the literary devices their authors employed?
Do you want to go first, Katrin? Okay. Well, when in terms of moving the debate, our volume was published some years ago now, and since then there have been some other really important volumes, and I'm sure you've talked about them on your podcast. I've got some of them here in front of me. You've mentioned Mark Goodacre's new book, but also this one, Wendy North, about what John knew and what John wrote. So this edited volume is belongs to a kind of a cluster of volumes that are kind of rethinking this question. I have to say, anecdotally, I know that people who were initially very suspicious of what we were doing are gradually changing their opinion. Maybe not in the sense that, John had a copy of Mark and that in front of him, and that he was kind of making all these changes in a very kind of close visual way. But the idea that John was very familiar with the Gospel of Mark, and perhaps a combination of knowing it well through performance, through recitation, but also, at various points had access to a copy and was working on it that way. So I think that's where our volume, and also the variety, you've got not just one author's kind of position here. You've got a whole group of scholars who are coming to this question independently, and yet, Helen was saying, we all got together and wanted to come to the same kind of conclusion at the end. If I can just say one other thing,
sure.
Again, another anecdote about we've got the conference coming up soon, the European Association of Biblical Studies, and I'm on the committee of the Johannine Seminar. We've got a special session there on this whole question of John and the synoptics. Mark Goodacre, Wendy North, and one of Helen's former students is also contributing, William Bowes, whose book is due out very soon. But what was really interesting, we had a call for papers for other sessions, and virtually all of them, looking at John, were wanting to raise questions about John's relationship with Mark or with Matthew and Luke. So I think, yeah, we are part of some kind of movement now that is really kind of, there's a lot of energy behind this now as we go forward.
Yeah, it just opens up a whole new lot of comparisons and interesting areas of debate, I think, that closed down for too long. But you asked about composition as well, and I think it, bringing John into the mix, I think it does add a huge amount to what we know about the way that these early Christ-following authors are writing. Before, it was when John was sort of hived off to one side, we just had this very sort of scribal way of doing things. Matthew very much working with Mark's text, adding little bits, taking them away, but really keeping very, very close. And Luke working in a slightly different way, but still keeping very close to what he finds in his Markan source. With John, though, and John, of course, operates in exactly the same way as most ancient Greco-Roman writers. He is using his source, but he's not at all constrained by it. He's certainly not copying out words here and there, and that sort of minute way that Matthew is doing it. So I think it highlights the literariness of John's gospel, and also I think sort of puts a slight sort of query over the way that Matthew and Luke are using Mark. I mean, because this is unusual. I mean, it, like I said before, it's sort of scribal. It feels very. It's not the way that people normally use texts in the ancient world. So it's sort of keeping it very close. And I think it's a sort of it just puts things out into slightly different perspectives than we had before. And I think that's a really useful thing to do.
Thank you. Well, just I always try to ask this kind of question because it has to do with expanding what other books, articles, monograph, whatever, that people can go and explore by themselves. So in terms of additional scholarly literature, what would you recommend? Right now, Professor Williams, yeah. Yeah,
Catherine has it in front of her.
She plugged Good Acres. Yeah.
Well, Wendy North's book is excellent, and has a very distinctive and original way of testing out John's relationship with Mark. Well, the synoptics, Luke and Matthew as well, looking also at how John uses the Jewish scripture. So I think that is a go-to. Helen did a review of Mark Goodacre's book at the SBL meeting, so you can say more about Mark's book.
Yeah, well, I think it's great, and I mean, what's interesting about that, and Wendy's and Wendy North's, and also James Barker. He's got a couple of books.
Oh yeah,
too. What's interesting about them is that whereas we were fairly modest in just looking at John's use of Mark, these are looking at John's use of all the synoptics, and that that will have to be argued for. I think I would certainly very easily go along with John knowing Luke. For me, it's still a bit of a question whether he knew Matthew, though I think I'm probably coming down to thinking he did, because there are a few little bits and pieces that seem to be just there in Matthew that then John does seem to reproduce, but that one I think is the more uncertain one. So some of these works are looking at John's use of all of the Gospels. What else is there? I mean, I think it's still really useful to look at Andrew Lincoln's commentary on John, because it's up to date, it's very thoughtful, and I mean, he actually started off assuming that John was independent and changed his mind as he was working on the commentary. So that's a very good starting point for anybody who's who's interested in sort of dipping their toe in this area, you know, see what Lincoln's got to say about it, and take it from there.
Correct me if I'm wrong. When you say Lincoln's, you mean the WBC commentary, or is there another
Yes,
one?
The Black's commentary series.
Oh,
yeah,
gotcha.
yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Mm.
All right.
Yeah.
I can never
All
remember.
right then.
The two articles I'd
checking.
also want to add are Richard Borkham's article, John for Readers of
Yes.
Mark, and Jörg Frei's article in German. And both of them were really kind of pioneering in looking at this whole question of, you know, how would John have written that gospel with an audience in mind without explaining, you know, who Peter is, who Mary Magdalene is, you know, and all these, whereas in other cases, John does explain things. So with kind of that notion that somehow knowledge of Mark is assumed by the author with reference to the audience.
Okay. What I can do for the audience, you know, watching now the video or later, I can go and drop the links there along with this interview. So you just click on it. It will take you right there to check out the articles and the books mentioned by Professor Williams and Bond. Ladies, that's all. I mean, this is fun. Thank you. I don't know if you have any last comments before leaving.
No, but thank you very much. It's been fun to relive it. It's been a few years now, hasn't it? So it's been good to think about it again.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
No, my pleasure. My pleasure. I need to say to the audience what I told you off camera, that these two distinguished ladies, they started making me nervous, but now we're good.
No.
Now we're good. Now we're good. No, just to let you know, Professor Bond, she knows the drill. Now, Professor Williams is part of the team here. So this is a platform for you guys. We just want to try to take advantage of new technology, you know, and just spread the word about scholarship. Myself here in Latino, you know, we're really behind you guys. Like, we are years and years behind in terms of what's coming new about, for example, this book that it's been the center of this discussion. I mean, we're just behind. We're just we need to catch up with a lot of literature. So we're trying to you know, with this kind of interviews, people who has a keen on this type of stuff, just can see it, learn something, you know, because there's a lot of hunger for good quality content in terms of biblical scholarship, and everyone's in there from their own places. I think we're trying to provide or to contribute something to fill that void to some degree. So I thank you for that, for your time and for being here. So with that in mind, and with Professor Bond and Professor Williams, this will be until the next time. Take care. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.